Okay, I have resorted to doing this video this way because every other way I've tried to do it, it has, deleted it and created all kinds of havoc. It won't upload, Canvas won't accept it. So we're gonna try it this way. I'll go through YouTube. So these are the pieces of the psychodynamic theory that I really felt you needed to have. And it's probably going to be short. The first one was 25 minutes. The second one was 18 minutes. The third one was 15 minutes. Maybe you'll get by with like 10 on this one. Because I think every time I try to re-record it, I think I get a little more succinct and clear about what it is I want you to understand. So here's what I want you to do. The reason I'm giving you this is because in my mind, you're missing out if you don't have psychodynamic theory, and you aren't going to get it anywhere but here. Okay? So that is why I keep persisting with this ridiculous video, because I need you to have this, because you won't get it from anyone but me at school. And it will help you so much when you work with kids, especially in elementary school and kindergarten, and because this is the primitive world in which they function. So if you think about biology, let's start with, we talked about biology, and we have this layer of biology. Freud was a neurologist, so he started at the level of biology. And then you have all of these little pieces and parts that come together in this big puzzle that make up a child's personality. And so for Freud, his stages were motivated by his understanding of the development of the central nervous system. So his first stage of infancy, he called the oral phase. Why? Because the central nervous system and its development is really focused in this oral area. Infants explore the world by putting things into their mouth. They have extra nerve endings that are sensitive here for breast or bottle feeding. And so they really incorporate the world, take it in through their mouth. So we called it the oral phase. And what do we extrapolate about that? We extrapolate that on top of this biological piece that you're born with and the biological maturation of the organism, there is a mind component, a psychology component, a sense of self and other. And other theorists have expanded on pieces and parts of his original theory, like the development of self, which we'll talk about in chapter 12. A little bit more, but he was really the first one to talk about this idea that there is a psychological developmental component. I'm trying to look down a little bit so it doesn't like reflect in my glasses. This psychological component that goes along with biological maturation. And so in the oral phase, it is really just like Erikson. Remember I told you Erikson was a student of Freud. So Erikson sort of focused on this social development, whereas Freud was much more focused on what he called the psychosexual stages, which in his mind had a lot more to do with biology, because he was a doctor, right? And Erikson was not. So there is this idea of the oral phase being about incorporating the good self. So being attended to, being kept warm, being fed, homeostasis, feeling calm creates a sense of a good inside and a good outside. And then understanding that there's an inside and that there's an outside. And it really is around conflicts of dependency and building relationships and developing a sense of objects, that there are objects in the world that are consistent that end up getting named, right? Mom, dad. And they become these sort of primary objects. And then you have these ever-evolving relationships with them where you go from a state of being symbiotic with the mother, right? The infant is symbiotic with the mother, literally, and then figuratively. So literally until the point of birth, and then there's a separation physically, but the psychological piece of it for Freud was still there. So there's this psychological birth of the infant is the name of a really good book, where we talk about how does a child become aware of objects in the world and things of that nature, and what does that do to the personality, and what does that do to the sense of relationship and self? So Freud focused on some really primitive stuff. He focused on the fact that there is primary process in this early phase, which means that there is no Piaget would have called it sensory. Freud called it primary process, because up could be down, down could be up. Fantasies and wishes can come true. 1 + 1 = unicorns and rainbows. You know, there are no structures that limit the self, and the self is all there is. There are the self and then these objects that it's tied to. And then as you get older, you begin, to slowly separate and become sort of your own psychological self. And you then hit toddlerhood. And the key things about toddlerhood is that they toddle, right? And so he called this the anal phase, because one of the biggest pieces of mastery in this phase is not just potty mastery, but it's mastery of keeping the self clean and dry. And so it is an investment in one's self as a separate object separate from the parents, that acts on the outside world, right? So it is a sense of, I can do it. And so for Erikson, he expanded that to understanding the sense of autonomy. But for Freud, it was more than that. It was about an investment in the self as being of value and worth keeping clean and dry, and this ability to separate from the parent and say the word no, right? And so psychologically, one begins to develop this sense of selfness and separateness, and this investment in taking care of the body, because the body is worthy of being taken care of. And when that gets mastered, then you go into what he called the phallic phase, which actually has two parts to it, the phallic narcissistic and the Oedipal, but we won't go into detail there. This idea of then investing in the body in a different way, because once the central nervous system develops so that the child has sphincter control, has body awareness, there's awareness of the genitals. And there's also at the same time an understanding of biologically identified gender, male, female, or boy, girl, or whatever pronouns you want to use there, or whatever nouns you want to use to describe that. Because there's femaleness and there's maleness, and that's not really what they're learning. They're learning their biological gender. I am a boy, I am a girl, because I have these body parts. And that's really where the concept of penis envy comes in. People, I think, take it too far. Certainly in the beginning, he made some assumptions about female psychosexual development based on this penis envy stuff. But it's not, in my mind, for me, my interpretation after 25 years of studying Freud is that this idea of penis envy, and when you work with kids for as long as I have, and you work with them on these primitive feelings, it's about, is my body correct? Because I am different. And that's what happens when you hit 3, is I am different from my mom, I am different from my dad, I am different from my friends, I am separate and I am different. I'm a girl, you're a boy, mom's a girl, dad's a boy. People start getting put into categories, and the kids are starting to figure all of that out. And they start to ask questions like, where do babies come from? And why can't I sleep with you? And why can't I marry you when I get older? Because they're trying to adjust to all of these different types of relationships that they're starting to have, separate from their primary relationships with the mother and the father. And so you'll see things like jealousy and a desire to get married, which is where the Oedipal conflict comes from. And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That as you get older, you tend to be attracted to grown-ups who have certain traits that your parents have. And if you've never thought about this on a conscious level before, I'm super sorry that I skeeved you out. But it is natural, is it not, that the people that you look for in your life and what you consider to be love would be defined unconsciously in your mind by your primary caretakers and how you experienced love from them, functional or dysfunctional? So through this Oedipal phase, you're starting to figure these kinds of things out. Like, what are all these different relationships about? And so he called it the phallic phase because it focused around gender and identity and that part of the body. You see little 4-year-old boys masturbating all the time. Little girls have a harder time. He had a harder time understanding little girls because everything that they experience is very abstract and internal, whereas boys are very external. And so there is this tendency for boys to have externalizing behaviors and girls to have internalizing behaviors. Girls are more likely to do things like cut and have eating disorders. Boys are more likely to have conduct disorders and act out. Everything's on the outside for them. And for girls, it's much more internalized. And for Freud, that came from this sense of that internalization of sexual identity for women and the more very external genitalia of the men, as recognized by the minds of us ourselves when we are 3 and 4 years old. So if you can resolve all of these kinds of issues, get your Oedipal stuff resolved, find out that you can't marry your parents, you start to externalize into outside of the family, and then, as it will happen, you start to go to school. just when your central nervous system is developed to the point where you are now kind of mastering your body. So you're running, you're jumping, you're skipping, your fine motor skills are getting into place, and cognitively you are ready to learn, and you become this sponge. And so for Freud, you go into the period of what he called latency, meaning that the psychosexual pieces of it become more latent. And layered on top of those impulses that we have, primitive impulses, right? If you've ever seen a 2-year-old, you know what a primitive impulse looks like. It's like they could eat you alive, or they could kill you, or they get so mad at you that they think that their mind can destroy you. But by the time they hit 6, they start to understand that they have a conscience, right? The conscience comes from the superego, Freud called it. That there is this balance that keeps you from hurting the objects that you love. And there are all of these defenses that could get put into place so that you have this development of morality, which I think we'll talk about in chapter 13. We'll talk about Kohlberg's stages of moral development. But for Freud, it really starts at about 5 years old, when you start to, you accept that you have to stay clean and dry. And then that becomes an important rule. And then you accept that you have to forego the love of one parent for the sake of maintaining the relationship of both parents. And you develop identifications and some other defenses about that. And you also start to develop things like guilt and remorse and those kinds of feelings, which inevitably lead to the development of the superego over the course of time. What's important for you guys to know about these kids as they enter latency, kindergarten, first grade, is that their conscience, their superego is super harsh. And so they will come home and say, my teacher hates me, my teacher yelled at me. And as the teacher, you're like, where are they getting these ideas from? Well, where they're getting them from is in their own head. So in their own head, they heard you yell at them. And you might not even know that they've done anything wrong, but their own conscience is an internalization of the angry voices of the adults around them who have chastised them at one point or another. But it comes with no love, like this really, really harsh thing. And so they can kind of hate themselves. And you have to really be careful as a teacher around how, in these first grade, second grade, third grade, how you use discipline, because it can come across to them way more harsh. So this is where I recommend teachers do things like, I'm really sorry you chose not to do your work and you're keeping yourself from going out to recess. Hopefully tomorrow you can be kinder to yourself, right? So you're internalizing that conflict for them so that it is not you doing things to them and punishing them, but it is be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself. You can be the person who does the right thing. You can do the yes thing even if you're feeling like it's a no. You can focus on your work. You can be kind to your classmates, this kind of stuff. And if you cannot do those things, then what you're doing is making the wrong choice that leaves you out of some preferred activity, whatever that might be, recess, or, you didn't focus and get your work done, so now you have to stay in for recess. You couldn't leave, you couldn't stop from touching this kid in class, and so now you have to stay in from recess, all that kind of stuff. And this gives them a sense of control over themselves, but it also helps to internalize that sense of conscience and morality, which is so important. And then we will leave off with Freud at adolescence, because that's kind of where he left off. That the goal of adolescence is really the finalization of the gender identity, sexual object choice, which is why you see sort of this resurgence of bisexuality. Freud felt that everybody was born bisexual, which is the ability to experience sensual pleasure, not sexual necessarily, but like a little kid is going to crawl into mom or dad's lap without concern for gender. As the kids get older, they will get more and more uncomfortable. And then certainly, obviously, as a teenager, you have less physical contact and hugging and cuddling with your parents than you did when you were little, because there's a taboo to that now, and it turns outward. And you may get boys will wrestle with each other, girls will hold hands with each other, whatever it might be. And then in adolescence, that turns into more of an adult, mature sexuality. And then you have object choice, not to mean that it's a conscious choice. This is all unconscious stuff after being born and having all this other stuff going on, that there is this sort of settling into one's sexuality. And that is why early adolescence can be such a struggle, because it reawakens all the conflicts from all the previous stages, and they all have to be worked through in Freud's mind for you to be sort of a functioning adult, a healthy functioning adult. So that's it, 15 minutes. I got it done in 15 minutes. So those are the pieces that I want you to know. So for your discussion question, this is where people started getting it wrong. You started writing the discussion questions when I was having trouble doing this lecture. I want you to take, if you're going to take that sort of industry versus inferiority stage, which is elementary school, then I want you to comment not just on that, but I want you to comment on the concept of latency and moral development. Okay, so latency in the development of conscience and the superego, and telling yourself what the right thing to do is, not just this idea of being good at something. Okay, so if you need a little more explanation, just Google latency phase Freud and you'll get Wikipedia, you'll get all kinds of stuff if this didn't make complete sense to you. Normally, this is an entire hour lecture that I do when we're face-to-face. So this is very much the abridged version. But I've added in pieces of it throughout each chapter, and I will talk about it again in chapter 13. But for this discussion question, what I wanted you to add in, if you're choosing that, if you're going to choose kindergarten, then you're choosing, if you're going to choose like preschool, kindergarten, you're choosing initiative on the Erikson part, and you're choosing like the phallic Oedipal on the Freud part. So if you're going to choose first grade, second grade, you're choosing latency on the Freud part. And so you're looking at development of the superego and rules and guilt. And then when you are looking at Erikson at that point, you're looking at industry versus inferiority, and you're looking at what it feels like. It feels, so for Erikson, it feels good to be good at school, but for Freud, it feels good to do the right thing and to follow rules. Okay, so that's kind of the piece of it. So if you need more information, which you probably will, you can Google latency phase for Freud and get, sort of a description of that, but focus on superego development. Okay, all right. Here's hoping like 5th time is the charm, and this video gets uploaded, or I don't even know what I'm going to do with myself here. All right, you guys have a good night.